I've always loved camping. There's something about the stillness of the woods, the smell of pine in the air, and the crackling of a fire under a blanket of stars that makes me feel alive. But now, I'll never step foot in the woods again. Last fall, my friends convinced me to rent a cabin deep in the forests of Montana for a long weekend. It wasn't one of those modern Airbnb types. It was rustic, a little rundown, and honestly, a little creepy. But we were drawn to it because it was completely off the grid. No cell service, no neighbors for miles, just us and nature. There were 6 of us. Me, my girlfriend Katie, and our friends Ryan, Amanda, Tim, and Claire. We were all city people, so the idea of roughing it felt like an adventure. But I wish we'd never gone. The trouble started the first night. We arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was starting to dip below the trees. The cabin was exactly what we'd imagined. A single-story wooden structure with a slanted roof, a front porch, and a rickety rocking chair swaying in the breeze. The place had clearly seen better days. The windows were dirty, the wood was warped, and the front door creaked ominously when we opened it. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and something faintly metallic. There was a stone fireplace in the living room, a small kitchen, and 2 bedrooms with old, mismatched furniture. It felt wrong. But we laughed it off, chalking it up to the age of the place. We spent the evening drinking and playing games by the fire. It was fun at first, but as the night went on, we started hearing noises outside. At first, it was faint. A rustling in the bushes, the snap of a twig. Tim joked it was probably a deer or a raccoon, but then we heard something heavy moving around the porch. The rocking chair creaked as if someone had sat down in it. Ryan grabbed a flashlight and opened the door, but there was nothing there, just the chair, rocking slowly back and forth in the windless night. He muttered something about the wind and came back inside, locking the door behind him. We all tried to shake it off and went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, heavy. They circled the cabin, crunching on the gravel path. I held my breath, praying it was just an animal. But then I heard it. A low, guttural humming. It was deep and raspy, like someone trying to sing through a throat full of gravel. I nudged Katie awake, whispering, "Do you hear that?" Her eyes widened as the humming grew louder, moving closer to the bedroom window. She grabbed my hand, her grip so tight it hurt. Then it stopped. Just silence. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it. But then the bedroom window rattled, as if someone was testing the lock. Katie and I didn't move. We just stared at the window, too terrified to breathe. The rattling stopped, and after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps faded into the woods. The next morning, I told the others what had happened. Claire and Amanda said they'd heard it too. The footsteps, the humming. Tim tried to laugh it off, saying it was probably just the wind, but his hands were shaking as he poured his coffee. We decided to stick together for the rest of the trip. No one wandering off alone. That day, we went hiking to take our minds off things. The forest was beautiful, but there was something off about it. The air felt too still, the birds too quiet. About 2 miles in trail, we found something that stopped us in our tracks. A circle of rocks in the middle of a clearing, with strange symbols carved into the trees surrounding it. The symbols looked old, almost ancient, and they gave me a sick feeling in my stomach. Ryan, ever the skeptic, laughed and said, "Some bored kids probably did this." But Claire wasn't convinced. She said the symbols looked like something she'd seen in an old anthropology book, something related to rituals. None of us wanted to stick around to find out what kind of rituals. We headed back to the cabin, but the unease didn't leave us. That night, things got worse. Much worse. It started with a knock on the door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. We all froze. Ryan grabbed a knife from the kitchen and motioned for everyone to stay back. He opened the door, but again, no one was there. Just the empty porch and the dark forest beyond. As soon as he closed the door, the knocking started again, this time at the back door. Tim, trying to be brave, opened it and yelled into the darkness, "Who's out there? Stop messing with us!" No response, just silence. Then from the woods, we heard the humming again. It was louder now, closer, and it sounded like there were multiple voices, low, droning, and inhuman. The sound surrounded the cabin, coming from all sides. Amanda started crying, and Claire was muttering something under her breath, maybe a prayer. We huddled together in the living room, all the lights on, trying to convince ourselves it would stop. But then the lights started flickering. The fireplace roared to life on its own, the flames unnaturally high and bright. Shadows danced on the walls, but they didn't match our movements. One shadow in particular caught my eye. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, spindly arms and a head that seemed to twist unnaturally. It stood in the corner of the room, unmoving, watching us. When I pointed it out, everyone turned to look, but the shadow didn't disappear. It just lingered there, like it was waiting. Then the cabin door slammed open, even though we'd bolted it. A gust of freezing air rushed in, extinguishing the fire. The humming grew deafening, like it was right inside our heads. Katie screamed, and suddenly the shadow moved. It stretched across the room, reaching for us. I don't remember much after that. Just flashes. Ryan yelling something. Amanda collapsing. Claire clutching a rosary she didn't have before. And the feeling of icy hands wrapping around my neck, squeezing until I couldn't breathe. When I came to, it was morning. The cabin was quiet. Too quiet. The others were there, but they looked as shaken as I felt. No one said a word as we packed up and left. We didn't talk about what happened. Not on the drive home. Not ever. But a week after we got back, I noticed something strange. A bruise on my neck, shaped like a handprint. Katie had one too, on her arm. We didn't tell the others, but I'm sure they had marks of their own. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the humming again. Faint, like it's coming from just outside my window. I've started sleeping with the lights on, but it doesn't help. I know it's still out there, whatever it is, watching, waiting. If you ever find yourself in a cabin in the woods and you hear that sound, leave. Don't look back. Just leave.
Story number 2.
I still don't know why I agreed to go that night. Maybe it was pride, maybe stupidity. Either way, I wish I'd never set foot in that cabin. It all started with a dare. My friend Ethan had heard about an abandoned hunting cabin deep in the Appalachian woods. The stories around it were infamous. Hunters who went missing, hikers who disappeared, strange lights seen from miles away. Local legend called it the Bleeding Hollow, though no one could explain why. Of course, Ethan thought it was all nonsense and decided we should spend the night there to prove it was just a bunch of scary campfire tales. There were 4 of us. Me, Ethan, Maya, and Jake. We were all juniors in college, riding the high of being young and fearless. Ethan had this reckless charm about him that made you want to follow him anywhere, even into danger. Jake was the skeptic, always cracking jokes to keep the mood light, and Maya, well, she didn't want to come at all. But Ethan had convinced her, like he convinced all of us. We hiked out late in the afternoon, armed with flashlights, sleeping bags, and a cheap bottle of whiskey. The woods were dense, the kind where sunlight barely breaks through, and by the time we found the cabin, dusk was already settling in. The place was worse than I'd imagined. It wasn't just abandoned, it was rotting. The roof sagged in the middle, the windows were shattered, and the front door hung off one hinge. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and decay. Animal bones littered the floor, some small, some disturbingly large. A broken table sat in the corner, and scratched into the wood were strange symbols, circles and lines that twisted in unnatural patterns. "Wow, this place is a real fixer-upper," Jake joked, kicking at the debris on the floor. His laugh echoed in the empty space, but it sounded wrong, hollow. We set up in the main room, spreading our sleeping bags around the remnants of a fireplace. Ethan lit a few candles he'd brought, their flickering light casting long, jagged shadows on the walls. "See? Nothing to worry about," he said, grinning as he unscrewed the whiskey bottle. Maya didn't respond. She was staring at the walls, her face pale. I followed her gaze and saw more symbols carved into the wood. They looked like they'd been done with a knife. Deep, angry gashes that seemed almost alive. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. As the night went on, we tried to make the best of it. We drank, told stories, and laughed nervously at every creak and groan the cabin made. But as the hours passed, the laughter faded. The air inside felt heavier, colder. Even the candles seemed to struggle, their flames dimming as if the darkness was swallowing them. Then came the knocking. It was faint at first, just 3 soft taps on the front door. We all froze, staring at each other. "Probably the wind," Ethan said, though his voice lacked conviction. Another knock. This time louder. Deliberate. "Who's there?" Ethan called, standing and grabbing a flashlight. He shone it through the broken window, but there was nothing outside. Just the trees, their branches clawing at the sky. "Let's just ignore it," Maya whispered, her voice trembling. But we couldn't ignore the next knock. It was deafening, like someone or something was pounding on the door with both fists. The sound reverberated through the cabin, shaking the walls. Jake stood up, his face pale. "Okay, this isn't funny anymore. Who's messing with us?" No one answered. The knocking stopped. For a moment, the silence was worse. Then we heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from just outside. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't human. It was wrong. Ethan motioned for us to stay back as he slowly approached the door. Don't. Maya hissed, grabbing his arm, but he shrugged her off. He yanked the door open, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Nothing. The porch was empty, the forest beyond eerily still. But as he stepped back inside, I saw it, just for a split second. A figure, standing at the edge of the woods. It was tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body, its head tilted unnaturally to the side, and its eyes... God, its eyes glowed. A sickly, yellow light that pierced through the dark like two burning coals. "Shut the door," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Ethan looked at me, confused, but he must have seen the terror on my face because he slammed the door shut without asking questions. "What did you see?" Maya asked, her voice shaking. I don't know," I stammered. "It was just something. In the woods." Ethan locked the door, but it didn't matter. The knocking started again, this time on the windows. All of them. The sound was relentless, coming from every direction. It wasn't just knocking anymore. It was scratching, clawing, as if the walls themselves were being torn apart. The growling returned, louder now, and accompanied by whispers, dozens of them, overlapping in a language I couldn't understand. Maya was crying, clutching her knees to her chest. Jake was pacing, muttering to himself. Ethan was trying to act calm, but I could see the fear in his eyes. Then the whispers stopped. The scratching stopped. Everything went silent. "Maybe it's gone," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. And that's when the door flew open. The force of it knocked Ethan to the ground. The candles went out, plunging us into darkness. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it at the door, but the beam flickered and died. All I could see was a shadow, a massive, twisting shadow that seemed to fill the room. And then it screamed. It wasn't a scream like anything I'd ever heard. It was a cacophony of voices, men, women, children, all crying out in agony. It felt like it was inside my head, tearing through my skull. I fell to my knees, clutching my ears, but it didn't help. The last thing I remember is Maya's voice, screaming my name as the shadow engulfed her. When I woke up, it was morning. The cabin was empty, the door wide open. My friends were gone. No footprints, no signs of a struggle, just gone. I stumbled out of the cabin and ran. I don't know how I made it back to the trailhead, but I did. I called the police, told them everything, but they didn't believe me. They said it was probably a prank gone wrong, that my friends had wandered off. Search parties were organized, but they never found anything. It's been 6 months. I still wake up at night, hearing that scream, and sometimes when I look out my window, I see them, those glowing yellow eyes, watching me from the trees. If you ever hear about the Bleeding Hollow, don't go. No dare, no thrill is worth what's waiting there.
Story number 3.
I wasn't supposed to be there. That's what I keep telling myself. If I hadn't been in that place at that exact time, maybe everything would be different, but there's no changing what happened. There's no forgetting it. It was a little over a year ago. I had just gone through a nasty breakup, and my friend Sarah thought a weekend getaway would help clear my head. She found this secluded cabin on some rental site, cheap, cozy, and tucked away in the forests of northern Maine. It looked perfect in the pictures, all rustic charm and scenic beauty. But the pictures didn't show everything. We left early Friday morning, me, Sarah, and her boyfriend Kyle. It was a long drive, the kind that makes you feel like the rest of the world is falling away behind you. By the time we got there, the sun was already setting, casting long shadows through the dense pine trees. The cabin was smaller than I expected. A single story, just one bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a living area with an old stone fireplace. The wood looked weathered, gray, and splintered, and the windows were coated in a thin film of grime. Something about the place felt off, but I didn't say anything. We unpacked, started a fire, and settled in for the night. Sarah and Kyle were laughing, joking, acting like everything was normal. I tried to join in, but there was this weight in the air, like the walls were holding something waiting to be let out. That first night, I barely slept. I kept hearing noises outside. Not animals, something bigger. Heavy footsteps crunching through the underbrush, moving slowly around the cabin. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow pass by the window, but when I got up to look, there was nothing there. Just the endless stretch of trees, their branches swaying in the wind. The next morning, I told Sarah and Kyle what I'd heard. Kyle laughed it off, saying it was probably a deer or a bear. Sarah, though, seemed uneasy. I thought I heard something too, she admitted, but I figured it was just my imagination. We spent the day hiking, trying to distract ourselves. The woods were beautiful, but there was something unsettling about them. No birdsong, no rustling squirrels, just silence. And the deeper we went, the darker it seemed to get, even though the sun was high in the sky. About 3 miles in, we found it, an old well, surrounded by a circle of moss-covered stones. It looked ancient, the kind of thing you'd expect to see in a ghost story. The stones were carved with symbols I didn't recognize, strange, jagged shapes that made my skin crawl just looking at them. Creepy, Kyle said, kicking a stone with his boot. Bet this thing's been here for centuries. Let's go, Sarah said quickly, her voice tense. Kyle wanted to stay and explore, but Sarah and I convinced him to leave. I didn't look back at the well, but I felt its presence, heavy and cold, like it was watching us. That night, everything got worse. It started with the lights. We were sitting by the fire, talking about the hike, when the overhead bulb began to flicker. At first, we thought it was just old wiring, but then the fire began to dim, the flames shrinking until they were barely visible. "What the hell?" Kyle muttered, poking at the logs. But the fire wouldn't catch again. Then came the smell. It was faint at first, like something rotting, but it grew stronger, filling the room with a sickly, sour stench. Sarah gagged, covering her mouth. "Is something dead in here?" she asked, her voice trembling. We searched the cabin, but there was nothing. No dead animals, no moldy food, nothing to explain the smell. And then we heard it, a faint whispering coming from outside. It wasn't the wind, it was voices, low and murmuring, speaking a language I didn't recognize. "Do you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide. Kyle nodded, grabbing the flashlight. "Stay here," he said, heading for the door. "Don't go out there," I hissed, grabbing his arm, but he shook me off. He opened the door and stepped outside, shining the flashlight into the trees. The light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but empty woods. "See? There's nothing." Before he could finish, the flashlight went out. The darkness swallowed him whole. "Kyle?" Sarah called, her voice shaking. There was no answer, just the whispers growing louder. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal, no way to call for help. Sarah was crying, clutching my arm as we stared into the black void where Kyle had disappeared. And then he came back. But something was wrong. He walked into the cabin slowly, his movements stiff and unnatural. His face was pale, his eyes blank. He didn't say a word, just stood there staring at us. "Kyle?" Sarah whispered. He didn't respond. "Kyle, what happened?" I asked, stepping closer. That's when I saw it, the mark on his neck. A deep, jagged cut that oozed dark, thick blood. I grabbed Sarah and pulled her back. "We need to go," I said, my voice barely steady. But before we could move, Kyle's head snapped toward us, his mouth stretching into a wide, unnatural grin. His teeth were sharp, jagged, and his eyes, they weren't his anymore. They were black, empty, like two voids staring straight through me. He lunged, faster than I thought possible. Sarah screamed as I shoved her toward the door. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing a chair and slamming it into Kyle's path. He didn't even flinch. We ran into the woods, the whispers chasing us. They were louder now, surrounding us, coming from everywhere. Sarah tripped, and I dragged her to her feet, adrenaline driving me forward. Behind us, I could hear Kyle, or whatever he had become, crashing through the trees, his guttural growls echoing in the night. We didn't stop until we saw the headlights. A truck was parked on the side of the dirt road, its driver stepping out as we stumbled toward him, screaming for help. He took one look at us, then at the forest behind us, and his face went pale. "Get in," he said, his voice low and urgent. We didn't argue. As we sped away, I looked back at the trees. For a moment, I thought I saw Kyle standing at the edge of the woods, his black eyes watching us. The driver didn't ask questions. He just dropped us off at the nearest town and left without a word. The police searched the cabin but found no sign of Kyle. No footprints, no blood, nothing. Sarah refuses to talk about it. She's moved out west, far from any forests. As for me, I still hear the whispers sometimes, in my dreams, in the quiet moments when I'm alone, and I know it's not over. Whatever was in those woods is still out there, waiting.
Story number 4.
I'll never forget the night I stayed in that cabin. I wasn't supposed to be there. The truth is, I stumbled into the place completely by accident, and I wish to God I'd never found it. It started when my car broke down on a remote stretch of road in the Adirondacks. I was driving back from a business trip, trying to take a scenic shortcut through the forest, but my GPS failed, and then my engine died. My phone had no service, and it was pitch dark except for the faint glow of the moon. I decided to walk, hoping to find help or at least some sign of life. The forest was dense, the trees towering over me like silent sentinels. The only sound was the crunch of my boots on the gravel road. After about an hour, I spotted a faint light through the trees, off the road and deeper into the woods. It flickered, like candlelight. I hesitated. Who lived out here? But as the cold bit into my skin, the idea of warmth, and maybe a phone, was too tempting to resist. I left the road and made my way through the underbrush, the light growing brighter with every step. That's when I saw the cabin. It was old, the kind of structure you'd expect to find in a history book. The wood was gray and warped, the roof sagging, but there was smoke rising from the chimney, and the windows glowed with a warm orange light. I knocked on the door, my breath visible in the freezing air. No one answered. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. "Hello?" I called out. "My car broke down. I just need a phone," or... The door creaked open on its own. Inside, the cabin was dimly lit by a single lantern on a wooden table. The furniture was sparse, a chair, a rickety bed, and a small stove. But there was no sign of anyone. "Hello?" I said again, stepping inside. The air was warm, but it smelled strange, like damp earth and something faintly metallic. I was about to turn and leave when I noticed something on the table. A plate of food. It looked fresh, bread, a hunk of meat, and a steaming mug of something that smelled like tea. "Hello?" I called again, louder this time. No answer. I should have left. I know that now. But the cold, the hunger, the exhaustion, it all made me reckless. I sat down and took a sip of the tea. It was bitter, but it warmed me instantly. I picked at the bread and meat, my stomach growling in gratitude. That's when I heard the whisper. It was faint, almost too soft to hear. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then it came again, clearer this time. A voice, low and raspy, coming from somewhere deep within the cabin. "Leave." I froze, my heart pounding. "Hello? Who's there?" The voice didn't answer. I stood up, every instinct screaming at me to get out, but something stopped me. Curiosity, maybe, or fear of the dark forest outside. I grabbed the lantern and started toward the sound, which seemed to be coming from a door at the back of the cabin. The door was small and narrow, with iron hinges that looked handmade. It wasn't locked, but it felt heavy as I pushed it open. Behind it was a staircase leading down into the ground. "Leave," the voice whispered again, louder this time. I should have listened, but instead I descended the stairs, the lantern shaking in my hand. The air grew colder with every step, and the metallic smell grew stronger. The stairs creaked under my weight, the sound echoing in the darkness. At the bottom was another door, this one even smaller, its wood scratched and worn. I hesitated, my breath catching in my throat. Something about that door felt wrong, but I opened it. The room beyond was small and circular, the walls made of rough stone. In the center was a wooden table, and on the table, I can barely describe it. It was a figure, human-shaped but wrong. Its body was covered in a thick, black tar that shimmered in the lantern light. Its arms were too long, its fingers ending in claws, and its face, it didn't have one. Just smooth, featureless flesh where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. It wasn't moving. It looked like a statue or a figure carved out of stone and tar. I was frozen, unable to look away, and then its head turned. The movement was slow, deliberate, and impossibly fluid, like its neck had no bones. I dropped the lantern, and the glass shattered, plunging the room into darkness. That's when it screamed. It wasn't a normal scream. It was high-pitched and deafening, like metal scraping against metal, and it felt like it was coming from inside my skull. I stumbled back, tripping over the uneven floor. The thing moved. I couldn't see it, but I could hear it, the wet, slithering sound of its body dragging across the stone. I scrambled up the stairs, my hands slipping on the slick wood. The scream followed me, growing louder, more shrill. I reached the top and slammed the door shut, my chest heaving. But the cabin wasn't safe anymore. The lantern was out, the fire in the stove extinguished. The warm glow from the windows was gone, replaced by total darkness. And then the whispers started again, louder this time, coming from every direction. "Leave. Leave. Leave." I didn't need to be told again. I bolted for the front door, throwing it open and running into the night. The forest was a blur as I sprinted back toward the road, the whispers echoing in my ears. When I reached the spot where my car had broken down, it was gone. There was nothing there. No car, no tracks, nothing to suggest I'd ever been there. A truck driver found me the next morning, wandering along the highway in a daze. I tried to explain what had happened, but he just gave me a look that made it clear he didn't believe a word. I went back a week later with a group of friends, determined to prove it wasn't all in my head. But the cabin was gone, not destroyed, not burned down, just gone. The spot where it had stood was nothing but bare earth and moss, as if it had never existed at all. I don't go into the woods anymore, not ever, because I know that cabin is still out there, waiting for its next visitor. And whatever's inside it, it's still waiting too.
Story number 5.
You know that feeling when you step into a place and your stomach twists, like your body knows something your mind hasn't figured out yet? That's exactly how I felt when I stepped into the old cabin at Blackwater Creek. I wasn't there for fun or thrills. My brother Connor had gone missing 3 weeks earlier while camping in the woods near the creek. He was experienced, smart, the kind of guy who could navigate any forest blindfolded. When the rangers gave up the search, I couldn't. Something in my gut told me he was still out there. So I packed a bag, grabbed his map, and headed out. The hike was grueling, with trails that disappeared into dense undergrowth and skies that darkened faster than I expected. Blackwater Creek was as unsettling as its name, its waters so dark they looked more like ink than water. I found the cabin just before sunset. It wasn't on Connor's map, but I recognized it immediately. A ranger had mentioned it in passing, a hunter's lodge built decades ago, abandoned after a string of strange deaths. I wasn't planning to stay there, but the sky had turned a bruised purple, and the thought of camping in the open forest wasn't appealing. The cabin looked wrong. The logs were blackened as though scorched, and the windows were grimy and cracked. There was a weird smell in the air like wet ash mixed with something rotten. But what choice did I have? The inside was worse. Dust coated every surface, and strange symbols were carved into the walls. They looked ancient, their jagged shapes almost pulsing in the dim light of my flashlight. A single chair sat in the middle of the room, facing a wall. The hair on my neck stood on end. I called out, hoping maybe, just maybe, Connor had taken refuge there. But my voice came back to me hollow, bouncing off the warped wood. I set up my sleeping bag in a corner, far from the eerie chair. I wasn't planning on sleeping, but exhaustion caught up with me. I must have dozed off because I woke to the sound of footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, moving across the creaky floor. My flashlight was still in my hand, so I clicked it on and aimed it at the center of the room. The chair was turned. I swear it had been facing the wall before I fell asleep. Now it faced me. "Connor?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The footsteps stopped. I stood, gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles ached. "Who's there?" The silence that followed was deafening. Then a soft knock came from the door. 3 knocks. I didn't move. I didn't speak. My heart was pounding so loudly it felt like it might burst. The knocks came again, louder this time, and then the whispers began. They weren't coming from the door. They were inside the cabin, circling me. I spun around, my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness, but there was no one there. The whispers grew louder, overlapping in a language I couldn't understand. Something heavy moved behind me. I turned, and the chair was gone. It was no longer in the middle of the room. It was now pushed into the farthest corner, shrouded in shadow. "Connor?" I called again, my voice breaking. The whispers stopped. For a moment there was nothing but the sound of my ragged breathing. And then I heard it. A voice, low and strained, coming from outside. "Help me." It was Connor. I ran to the door, flinging it open. The forest was impossibly dark, my flashlight barely cutting through the thick fog that had rolled in. But I heard him again, faint and desperate. "Help me." I followed the sound, my boots crunching over dead leaves and brittle twigs. The trees seemed closer together now, their branches twisting unnaturally. "Connor, where are you?" I shouted. His voice came again, clearer this time. "Here. I'm here." I pushed through the undergrowth until I reached a clearing. In the middle of it was the creek, its black waters reflecting the pale moonlight. And standing at the edge was Connor. "Connor!" I ran toward him, tears streaming down my face. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. He wasn't moving. He just stood there, his back to me, staring into the water. His clothes were tattered, his skin pale and slick like it had been pulled too tightly over his bones. "Connor?" I said, my voice trembling. He turned slowly and my blood ran cold. It wasn't him, it looked like him. Same face, same eyes. But there was something off. His mouth stretched too wide when he smiled, his teeth jagged and yellow, and his eyes, oh God, his eyes, they weren't human. They were black, bottomless pits that seemed to pull the light from the air. "Help me," he said again, his voice distorted and wrong. I stumbled back, tripping over a root. The thing that looked like Connor started walking toward me. its limbs jerking unnaturally, like a puppet on broken strings. I turned and ran, crashing through the trees, the whispers returning and growing louder. The forest seemed alive now, branches clawing at me as I passed. I don't know how I found the cabin again, but when I burst through the door, I slammed it shut and bolted it with the rusted latch. The whispers stopped. For a moment, I thought I was safe. But then I heard it. The knock. 3 knocks, louder this time, rattling the entire cabin. "Let me in," the voice said. It was Connor's voice, but I knew it wasn't him. "Go away," I screamed. The knocking stopped, replaced by the sound of footsteps circling the cabin. And then I heard the whispers again, this time coming from the walls themselves. The symbols carved into the wood began to glow, faint at first, but growing brighter until the room was bathed in a sickly green light. And then the chair, it was back in the center of the room. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The chair creaked as if something invisible had just sat down, and then it spoke. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice said, deep and guttural. The air grew colder, the light from the symbols pulsating. I felt something brush past me, something cold and slimy, but there was nothing there. I don't remember how I got out. The next thing I knew, I was stumbling back onto the road, the cabin nowhere in sight. A passing car picked me up, and I told the driver I'd gotten lost while hiking. I didn't mention the cabin. Who would believe me? Connor was never found. Sometimes late at night, I hear his voice. Faint, desperate, calling for help. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I see the cabin again. The glowing symbols, the empty chair. It's waiting for me.
Story number 6.
I should have never agreed to go to the cabin. Deep down, I knew something wasn't right about the whole thing, but I let my friends talk me into it. "It's just for the weekend," they said. "It'll be fun." But fun wasn't the word I'd use to describe what happened out there. The cabin belonged to Lauren's family, though it had been abandoned for decades. Her great-uncle had built it in the 1920s, a hunting lodge tucked deep in the woods of West Virginia. No one in her family ever talked about it much, except to say it was bad luck. Lauren said she thought that was just an old wives' tale, a way to explain a series of unfortunate events, like her great-uncle disappearing out there one winter. The drive to the cabin was long, the road twisting through miles of forest. By the time we arrived, it was almost dark. The cabin stood at the edge of a clearing, its weathered boards and sagging roof looking like they'd barely survived the decades. "Charming," Ethan said with a laugh, slinging his backpack over one shoulder. "It's got character," Lauren shot back, though even she sounded unsure. The inside was worse. Dust coated every surface and cobwebs hung like curtains from the ceiling. The furniture was ancient, the kind of stuff you'd find in a flea market but wouldn't dare bring home. The air was heavy, carrying the faint scent of mildew and something else, something metallic and sour. Still, we unpacked and made the best of it. We built a fire in the old stone fireplace, ate some sandwiches we'd packed, and started talking about the history of the place. That's when Lauren brought up the mirror. "There's this old mirror upstairs," she said, her voice low. "They say it's cursed." "Cursed?" Ethan scoffed. "Come on, that's such a cliché." "No, seriously," Lauren insisted. "My grandma said the mirror was brought here from some estate sale in Europe. The guy who sold it warned my great-uncle that it was dangerous." "What does that even mean?" I asked, my stomach nodding. Lauren shrugged. "All I know is people who looked into it started acting weird. My great-uncle moved it upstairs to the attic to keep it out of sight. After he disappeared, no one touched it. Let's see it," Ethan said, grinning. "No way," Lauren snapped. "It's staying in the attic." That should have been the end of it. But Ethan was stubborn. Later that night, after everyone else had gone to bed, I heard him moving around. Curious, I got up to see what he was doing and found him at the base of the attic stairs, flashlight in hand. "Don't tell Lauren," he whispered, flashing me a grin. "I just want to see what the big deal is." "Ethan, don't," I hissed. "You heard her. That mirror's bad news." He rolled his eyes. "It's a piece of glass, not a portal to hell." Before I could stop him, he was climbing the stairs. I hesitated, then followed, my gut screaming at me to turn back. The attic was cold and dark, the air thick with dust. The beam of Ethan's flashlight swept over stacks of old furniture and boxes, finally landing on the mirror. It was enormous, standing at least 7 feet tall, with an ornate silver frame carved into intricate, swirling patterns. The glass was cloudy, as if it had aged along with the cabin, but it still reflected the room in eerie detail. Ethan approached it, his flashlight bouncing off the glass. "This is it?" he said, sounding unimpressed. "Let's go." I said, my voice shaking, but he didn't move. Instead, he reached out and touched the glass. The moment his fingers made contact, the room seemed to shift. The air grew colder, and the shadows in the corners of the attic seemed to deepen. "Ethan," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Let's go, now." He didn't respond. "Ethan?" He was staring into the mirror, his face pale, his eyes wide. His flashlight slipped from his hand and clattered to the floor, the beam spinning wildly. "Ethan," I grabbed his arm, but it was like trying to move a statue. His reflection in the mirror was wrong. It was him, but his face was twisted, his mouth stretched into a grotesque grin that didn't match the slack, terrified expression on his real face. And then his reflection moved. I swear to God, it moved. It raised a hand, pressing it against the inside of the glass as if trying to push through. I yanked Ethan away, and the spell seemed to break. He stumbled back, blinking rapidly, his breath coming in shallow gasps. What was that?" he stammered. "We need to leave," I said, grabbing his arm and dragging him back down the stairs. "We didn't tell the others. What could we say? That the mirror was alive? That it was watching us?" But Ethan wasn't the same after that. He barely spoke, barely ate. He just sat by the fire, staring into the flames with hollow eyes. That night, I woke to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was Lauren or Ethan going to the bathroom, but the footsteps didn't stop. They paced up and down the hallway, slow and deliberate. I got up and opened my door, expecting to see Ethan or Lauren. Instead, I saw the attic door. It was wide open, though we'd closed it earlier. "Ethan?" I whispered, stepping into the hallway. The footsteps stopped, and then I heard it, a soft, wet tapping sound, like fingers drumming on glass. I turned and saw him, Ethan, standing at the foot of the attic stairs, staring up into the darkness. "Ethan, what are you doing?" I asked, my voice shaking. He didn't respond. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't coming from the attic. It was coming from the mirror. I grabbed Ethan's arm, but he yanked it away, his movements jerky and unnatural. "Ethan, stop!" I shouted. He turned to me and I froze. His eyes were black, completely black, like two endless voids, and his mouth was twisted into that same grotesque grin I'd seen in the mirror. "I have to go," he said, his voice flat and hollow. "No, you don't," I yelled, pulling him back. But he was too strong. He broke free and disappeared up the stairs. I didn't follow him. I couldn't. Instead, I woke Lauren and the others, babbling about Ethan and the mirror. By the time we got to the attic, he was gone. The mirror was shattered, shards of glass scattered across the floor. But when I looked at the largest piece, I saw Ethan's reflection, grinning at me from the other side. We left the cabin that night, abandoning everything we'd brought with us. Ethan was never found. But sometimes, late at night, I catch my reflection moving when I'm perfectly still. And when I look closely, I swear I see him, grinning back at me from the other side of the glass.
Story number 7.
I've always believed there's a moment in your life when you know you've made a mistake, an irreversible one. Mine came the night I stayed in the Mercer House cabin. I'd heard the rumors, of course. Everyone in our little town had. The cabin was cursed, haunted, a place you didn't go unless you wanted trouble. It had been abandoned for decades, left to rot at the edge of the woods like a festering wound. People whispered about what happened there, how a family had moved in during the 1950s and disappeared without a trace. Some said they'd gone mad and killed each other. Others claimed something in the woods had taken them. I wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories, but desperation makes you reckless. My car had broken down on Route 9 and the nearest town was miles away. My phone had no signal, and the rain was coming down in thick, relentless sheets. I could barely see the road in front of me. That's when I saw the cabin. Its silhouette loomed through the trees, the faint glow of a candle flickering in one of the windows. My stomach twisted as I stared at it, but the rain was soaking through my jacket and I didn't have many options. I told myself the stories were just that, stories. I knocked on the door, my knuckles echoing against the warped wood. No answer. I knocked again. Nothing. Finally, I pushed the door open. The inside of the cabin was worse than I expected. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something sour, like meat left out to rot. The furniture was covered in dust and cobwebs, but there were signs that someone had been there recently. A chair was pulled up to the table, a plate of half-eaten food sitting on it, and the candle in the window was still burning. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is anyone here?" Silence. I should have turned around and left us, but the rain outside was relentless, and I was freezing. I told myself I'd just stay until the storm let up, just a few hours. I lit another candle I found on the mantel and sat down in the chair. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, and I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around me. That's when I noticed the smell. It was stronger now, more putrid, like something had died and been left to rot. I turned, shining my flashlight into the shadows of the cabin. My beam landed on a door at the far end of the room. It was slightly ajar, revealing a set of stairs leading down into the basement. "Hello?" I called again, louder this time. The wind outside answered me with a mournful wail. I don't know what possessed me to do it. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that the stories weren't real. Whatever it was, I got up and walked toward the door. The air grew colder with every step. By the time I reached the basement, my breath was fogging in front of me. The stairs creaked under my weight, each one groaning like it might give way. The basement was pitch black. My flashlight barely penetrated the darkness, but I could see enough to know that something was wrong. The walls were covered in scratches, deep gouges that looked like they'd been made by claws. Symbols were carved into the floor, circles and lines that didn't make any sense to me, but they made my skin crawl. And then there was the smell. It was so strong down there, so overwhelming that I gagged. It was like standing in a slaughterhouse, the stench of blood and decay so thick it clung to my clothes. "Hello?" I whispered, though I didn't want an answer. I stepped deeper into the basement, my flashlight sweeping across the room. That's when I saw it, a trapdoor in the floor, the wood stained dark and wet. Something moved beneath it. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The trapdoor rattled, the sound sharp and violent in the silence. Whatever was under there was trying to get out. "Help me," a voice whispered. It was faint, barely audible, but I heard it. It was coming from beneath the trapdoor. "Please," the voice said again, more insistent this time. I don't know what I was thinking. I should have run. I should have turned around and bolted up those stairs, out into the storm, and never looked back. But I didn't. I reached down and grabbed the edge of the trapdoor. It was cold and slick, and it took all my strength to pull it open. What I saw will haunt me until the day I die. It was a person, or at least it had been. Their skin was gray and mottled, stretched taut over bones that jutted out at sharp angles. Their eyes were wide and empty, their mouth twisted into a permanent scream, but they were alive. They reached for me, their bony fingers clawing at the air. "Help me," they rasped, their voice like the rustling of dry leaves. I stumbled back, my flashlight slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. The figure pulled itself out of the trapdoor, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette on tangled strings. Its head snapped toward me, and for a moment I thought I saw recognition in its hollow eyes. "Run," it whispered. Then the shadows came alive. They poured out of the trapdoor like smoke, swirling and coiling around the figure. They reached for me, their touch icy and sharp, and I ran. I didn't stop until I was back in the main room of the cabin, slamming the basement door shut behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might burst. The cabin was different now. The candlelight flickered wildly, casting strange shapes on the walls. The shadows moved on their own, twisting and writhing like they were alive. And then I heard it. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming up the basement stairs. "Help me," the voice called again, but it wasn't the same. It was distorted now, deeper and darker, like something was imitating the voice but didn't quite know how. The door rattled. I ran. I didn't stop until I was back on the road, the rain soaking through my clothes. When I finally looked back, the cabin was gone. The clearing was empty, the woods silent. But I still hear the voice sometimes, late at night, whispering in the dark, "Help me."
Story number 8.
When I think back to that night, I wish I had ignored the dare. It was supposed to be just another harmless camping trip, a little escape into nature with my closest friends, but it turned into something far worse, something I still can't explain. We were 5 in total, me, Jake, Sarah, Kyle, and Megan, and we'd picked a remote area in the Appalachians to camp. It was late fall, the air crisp but not too cold, and the forest seemed to glow with shades of red, orange, and gold. We were a little off the grid, but that's exactly what we wanted. Our campsite was a clearing near a small creek, and everything was perfect, at first. The fire crackled, stories were told, and laughter echoed into the woods. Then Jake, always the bold one, brought up the cabin. "Ever heard about the widow's cabin?" he asked, his grin wide and mischievous. Kyle groaned. "Oh, come on, Jake. Not this again." "No, seriously," Jake insisted, leaning forward, his face lit by the flickering firelight. It's real. My uncle swears it's still out there, just a couple miles from here. They say it belonged to some woman in the 1800s, a widow who went mad after losing her husband in the war. She started inviting travelers in, feeding them, letting them stay the night, and then she'd kill them. She kept their bodies hidden under the floorboards. Nice bedtime story, Sarah said, rolling her eyes. But here's the thing, Jake continued, his tone more serious now. No one found the bodies, and no one ever found her, just her cabin. My uncle says people who find it don't come back. I laughed nervously, brushing it off, but the story settled in my chest like a stone. Jake said suddenly. The rest of us groaned, but Megan, always up for an adventure, chimed in. Why not? It could be fun. Kyle shook his head. You two are insane. I'm not going. I'll go, Sarah said, smirking, if only to prove Jake's full of crap. They all looked at me. I hesitated, but the mocking grin on Jake's face pushed me over the edge. Fine, I muttered, but only for a little while. We grabbed flashlights and headed into the woods, leaving Kyle behind to tend the fire. The forest was darker than I expected, the moonlight barely penetrating the canopy. Twigs snapped underfoot, and the cold seemed sharper away from the fire. Jake led the way, claiming he knew roughly where the cabin was. Sarah was skeptical, teasing him every time we took a wrong turn. But after about an hour of wandering, we found it. The cabin was smaller than I imagined, nestled between two towering pines. The wood was weathered and gray, and the roof sagged in the middle. A single window, cracked and filthy, stared back at us like a blind eye. See? Told you, Jake said, his grin triumphant. Great, Sarah muttered. We found a rotting shed. Can we go back now? But Jake was already at the door, pushing it open. The air inside was stale and thick, carrying the faint scent of decay. Our flashlights swept across the room, revealing a table covered in dust, a rocking chair tipped on its side, and a fireplace filled with charred wood. Something about the place felt wrong. The shadows seemed to shift when we moved, and the air was colder inside than it had been in the woods. Okay, we've seen it. Let's go, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. Wait, Jake said, crouching by the fireplace. There's something here. I stepped closer, reluctantly. There were carvings on the stones surrounding the hearth, symbols I didn't recognize. Circles, triangles, and jagged lines that seemed to pulse under the beam of my flashlight. Don't touch it, Sarah warned. But Jake was already reaching for one of the stones. The moment he touched it, the cabin changed. The air grew heavier, pressing down on my chest. The shadows in the corners of the room thickened, twisting into shapes that almost looked human. And then we heard it, a soft creak like the groan of old wood under weight. It came from the far corner of the room, where a trapdoor lay partially hidden beneath a moth-eaten rug. Did anyone else hear that? Megan whispered, her voice trembling. Jake moved toward the trapdoor, his flashlight trembling in his hand. Jake, don't, I said, my heart pounding. But he didn't listen. He pulled the rug back and grabbed the rusted handle. The creaking grew louder, and for a moment I thought the floorboards themselves were breathing. When Jake yanked the trapdoor open, the stench hit us first. A foul, putrid smell that made my stomach churn. Below was a narrow staircase, descending into darkness. Let's go, Sarah said, backing toward the door. But Jake was already stepping down. Jake, I hissed. I'll be quick. He called back, his voice echoing unnaturally. Megan followed him, then Sarah, and finally me. I didn't want to be left alone upstairs. The basement was worse than the cabin above. The walls were damp and crumbling, and the air was so cold I could see my breath. Our flashlights revealed more of the strange carvings, this time etched into the walls. And then we saw them. Bones. They were scattered across the floor, some still wrapped in tattered scraps of fabric. Skulls stared back at us, their hollow eyes filled with darkness. Megan screamed, her flashlight clattering to the floor. We need to leave, I said, grabbing Jake's arm. But before we could move, the door slammed shut above us. The sound echoed through the basement, followed by the soft creak of the rocking chair upstairs. What the hell was that? Sarah whispered, clutching my arm. And then we heard the humming. It was faint at first, a soft, lilting tune that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It grew louder, filling the space around us, vibrating in my skull. A shadow moved at the edge of the room. Who's there? Jake called, his voice shaking. The shadow moved closer, separating from the darkness. It was a woman. At least, it looked like one. Her face was pale and sunken, her eyes black pits. Her mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, and her hands were clawed, the nails long and sharp. You came to my house, she whispered, her voice a rasp that echoed in the room. We froze, paralyzed by her gaze. "You shouldn't have come," she said, stepping closer. Her grin widened as she raised one hand, pointing a crooked finger at Jake. He screamed, clutching his chest, and collapsed to the floor. "Run," Sarah whispered, grabbing my hand. We bolted up the stairs, throwing ourselves against the trapdoor. It wouldn't budge. The humming grew louder, and when I looked back, she was there, standing at the base of the stairs. "Stay with me," she whispered, reaching out. I don't know how we got the trapdoor open, but when we did, we didn't stop running. We didn't look back. We found Kyle at the campsite, his face pale as a sheet. "What happened?" he asked, but none of us could answer. Jake never made it out of that cabin. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I still hear the humming.
Story number 9.
I used to think ghost stories were nothing more than campfire tales, stories designed to scare kids and entertain skeptics. But after what happened to me in that cursed cabin in Maine, I know better. I don't tell this story to scare people. I tell it because it's the truth. It all started when my girlfriend Anna convinced me to rent a cabin for the weekend. She'd found it online, a quaint little place deep in the woods, miles from civilization. It was cheap, almost suspiciously so, but we were broke college students, and a secluded weekend sounded like a dream. The drive there was uneventful, but the moment we pulled into the driveway, unease settled over me. The cabin was old, far older than it looked in the pictures. The wood was weathered and dark, the windows covered in grime. The trees around it were dense and gnarled, their bare branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. "Cozy, isn't it?" Anna said, smiling as she grabbed her bag. I forced a grin and followed her inside. The interior was better kept than I expected. Rustic but clean, with a fireplace in the living room and a small kitchen stocked with basic supplies. The air, however, was heavy, like the cabin itself was holding its breath. The first night was uneventful. We cooked dinner, played board games, and drank cheap wine until we were too tired to stay awake. But when I crawled into bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I woke around 3 a.m. to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was Anna, but when I turned over, she was still in bed, her back to me, breathing softly in her sleep. The footsteps weren't in the cabin. They were on the roof. I froze, listening as the sound moved slowly from one end of the cabin to the other. It wasn't an animal. It was too heavy. Whoever or whatever it was, they were walking deliberately, their footsteps steady and unhurried. I nudged Anna awake, whispering, "Do you hear that?" She groaned, half asleep. "It's probably a raccoon. Go back to bed." But it wasn't a raccoon. The footsteps stopped directly above our bedroom, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then came the scratching, a slow, deliberate scrape of nails or claws against the wooden roof. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. After what felt like an eternity, the sound stopped. The next morning, I told Anna what I'd heard. She laughed it off, saying it was just my imagination. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Things got worse that night. We were sitting by the fire, playing cards, when the first knock came. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it made both of us freeze. "Did you hear that?" I asked. Anna nodded, her face pale. The knock came again, louder this time. It was coming from the front door. "Who could it be out here?" she whispered. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously approached the door. My hand trembled as I turned the knob and swung it open. No one was there. The forest beyond the porch was pitch black, the trees swaying gently in the wind. I shone my flashlight into the darkness, but it didn't reveal anything. "Probably some prankster," I said, trying to convince myself more than Anna, but I didn't believe it. We locked the door and went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Around midnight, the knocking started again. This time, it wasn't just at the door. It was coming from the walls, the windows, even the floor. It was as if the cabin itself was alive, something inside it trying to get out, or in. Anna was terrified, clutching my arm as we sat huddled in the bed. I wanted to tell her we'd leave in the morning, but deep down I wasn't sure we'd make it that long. The knocking stopped just before dawn, leaving behind a deafening silence. When the sun rose, we decided we'd had enough. We packed our bags in record time, determined to get out of there. But the forest had other plans. As we were loading the car, we heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the trees. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through my chest. "Get in the car," I told Anna, my voice shaking. She didn't argue, scrambling into the passenger seat as I jumped behind the wheel. I started the engine and slammed on the gas, the tires spinning in the dirt before catching traction. The growling followed us. It wasn't until we were miles away that I finally felt like I could breathe again. But the relief was short-lived. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw something standing in the middle of the road behind us. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, spindly limbs and a head that almost grazed the tops of the trees. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the darkness, and its mouth was a gaping void. I don't remember much after that. Anna said I screamed and nearly drove us off the road, but by the time I stopped the car, the thing was gone. We didn't talk about it on the drive home. What was there to say? It's been months since that night, and I still can't explain what happened. The cabin's listing has disappeared from the website, and when I tried to find its location again, it was like it had never existed. But sometimes late at night, I hear the knocking again. It's faint, almost imperceptible, but I know it's there, and I know it's waiting for me to come back.
Story number 10.
It was supposed to be a weekend to clear my head, a solo getaway to a cabin deep in the forests of Vermont. I was burned out from work and needed some time to disconnect. No phone, no emails, just me, nature, and a few good books. When I found the listing online, it seemed perfect. A secluded, rustic cabin with a wood stove and hiking trails nearby. The reviews mentioned how quiet it was, how peaceful. That's exactly what I needed. I arrived late in the afternoon. The drive had been long, and the roads leading to the cabin were little more than dirt paths. By the time I pulled up, the sun was setting, bathing the surrounding trees in shades of orange and red. The cabin itself was simple but charming. Weathered wood, a small porch, and a stone chimney that gave it a homey feel. The inside was sparse but clean. A small kitchen, a fireplace, a cozy couch, and a single bedroom with a bed that creaked when I sat on it. There were no neighbors for miles, just the forest stretching endlessly in all directions. Perfect. After unpacking, I made some tea and settled by the fire with a book. The silence was incredible, almost too quiet. No cars, no hum of electricity, just the occasional rustle of leaves outside. It was unnerving at first, but I told myself to enjoy it. By the time I went to bed, the cabin was pitch dark. The only light came from the faint glow of the moon through the small bedroom window. I fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the drive. I woke up to the sound of footsteps. It was faint at first, a soft crunching of leaves, but as I lay there holding my breath, it grew louder. Someone or something was walking around outside. I grabbed my phone to check the time. 3:12 a.m. I wanted to call someone, but there was no signal. I reminded myself that I was miles from civilization. It was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the footsteps were too heavy for that. I got out of bed as quietly as I could and crept to the window. The moonlight illuminated the clearing in front of the cabin, but I didn't see anyone. Still, the footsteps continued, circling the cabin slowly, deliberately. I froze when I heard the sound move to the porch. The boards creaked under the weight of something heavy. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought whoever, or whatever, was out there would hear it. The doorknob rattled. I backed away, my mind racing. Should I confront them? Stay quiet? The door was locked, but the cabin felt too flimsy, too fragile. The rattling stopped, and the footsteps moved away from the porch. I waited, holding my breath, straining to hear where they went. The forest was silent again, the only sound the distant hoot of an owl. I barely slept the rest of the night. When the sun finally rose, I ventured outside to look for tracks. The dew on the grass should have made it easy to see where someone had walked, but there was nothing. No footprints, no trampled grass, nothing. It didn't make sense. I told myself I must have imagined it. Maybe I'd been dreaming, half asleep and paranoid. That had to be it. I spent the day hiking, trying to distract myself, but the unease lingered. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves set me on edge. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful when I arrived, now felt oppressive, like it was watching me. When night fell, I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and kept the fireplace burning for light. I told myself I was being ridiculous, letting my imagination run wild. Around midnight, the knocking started. It was soft at first, a light tapping on the door. I froze, staring at the entrance, my pulse racing. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaking. No answer. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't frantic, it was steady, deliberate. I grabbed the fire poker and approached the door, my hands trembling. "Who's there?" The knocking stopped. For a long moment there was silence. Then I heard it, a whisper, faint but unmistakable. "Let me in." It wasn't a voice I recognized. It wasn't even fully human. It was guttural, distorted, like it came from deep within someone's throat. I backed away from the door, Bahal clutching the fire poker like a lifeline. "Go away!" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. The whisper came again, this time closer. "Let me in." And then the knocking started on the windows. All of them. It was impossible. There were windows on every side of the cabin, and the knocking came from all of them at once. It was as if the entire cabin was surrounded. I dropped the fire poker and bolted for the bedroom, locking the door behind me. The knocking didn't stop. It grew louder, more frantic, the sound echoing in my ears, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence was deafening. I sat on the floor, shaking, waiting for something to happen. Hours passed and nothing came. When dawn finally broke, I packed my things and left. I didn't care about losing my deposit or leaving the place a mess. I just wanted to get out of there. But as I drove away, I noticed something in the rearview mirror. Standing at the edge of the forest, just beyond the clearing, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs too long for its body. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and its eyes, if it had any, were hidden in the shadow of its face. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. I didn't look back again. It's been months since that weekend, and I still don't know what I encountered in that cabin. Sometimes late at night, I hear knocking on my apartment door. When I check, there's no one there, but I know it's waiting.